Hello and welcome to America's Veterans. My name is Len SIROTZKI. I'm a member of the Manatee County Veterans Council, and I will be your host for this special program being brought to you from the Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. In some sense, the history of our world could be described in terms of good versus evil. And when we think of evil, perhaps nothing personifies that word more than does Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. During World War II, I felt so guilty because I wasn't old enough to serve in the military. I tried to do my part by buying savings stamps at school nearly every Friday. I collected all kinds of junk items, and especially tinfoil, which I would form into large balls. I was so proud when I could finally take one of those large tinfoil balls to the junkyard. I remember when the house lights would come on at the old Hollywood Theater on West Fullerton in Chicago, and Red Cross ladies would walk the aisles with their collection cans. I would dig like crazy deep into my pockets, searching for a couple of pennies so that I could give my donation. My mother worked in a tank parts factory just through the alley from our house. My father was in the Army, a career soldier. It seemed like every person I knew was doing something to win the war. And when the end finally came, I was still a young boy, yet I thought I had understood what the war was all about. I knew about Pearl Harbor and the 5 Sullivan brothers. I knew about Joe Louis, Ted Williams, Glenn Miller, and the Stage Door Canteen. Spike Jones played a ditty about what we would do in the Fuhrer's face. I knew about the massive bombings of Europe, the Battle of Iwo Jima, and then Hiroshima. I knew about concentration camps, but it would take many years before I had any real understanding of what was meant by an extermination camp or the Holocaust. One of the most moving experiences in my life came in 1989 when I went to that house in Amsterdam where young Anne Frank was forced to live as a prisoner prior to her death from typhus at age 16 at Bergen-Belsen camp. Then last summer I visited Germany and Dachau, one of Hitler's notorious concentration camps. Parts of the camps have been preserved with the intent that the world should never forget what happened there. You can see mounds of earth containing masses of bones mixed with ashes of so many unnamed persons. The cells, the medical laboratories, the gas chambers, and the crematorium are still there. In the same instant, I was sad and angry. Hitler had seized power on January 30, 1933, and on March 20, 1933, Munich's chief of police, Heinrich Himmler, announced that Dachau would become Hitler's first concentration camp with an initial capacity of 5,000. The world knew, and the world did nothing. In November 1938, using a fabricated excuse, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief of propaganda, called for an attack on international Jewry. The pogrom has come to be known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On the nights of November 9 and 10, rampaging mobs throughout Germany attacked Jews in the streets, in their homes, places of work and worship. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Between 1,000 and 2,000 synagogues were burned, and almost 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Cemeteries and schools were vandalized, and about 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. 3 days later, a meeting of top Nazi leadership was convened, and it was decided that the Jews had started the riots and that they would pay for all damages. Hermann Göring announced, "I have received a letter written on the Führer's orders requesting that the Jewish question be now, once and for all, coordinated and solved one way or another." Kristallnacht may be considered as the actual beginning of what is now called the Holocaust. By the time that American and Allied liberators reached the concentration camps in 1945, some 6 million Jews men, women, and children, plus an additional 5 million others, had been murdered. Our 3 guests lived under the Nazi regime, and 2 of them are actual camp survivors. We will hear from each of them, have a brief tour of the Florida Holocaust Museum, and learn about a very special upcoming event. Hello, I'm standing here with Felix David LAZAR, a survivor who's been gracious enough to be a part of our Holocaust special. And Felix, I want to thank you very much for joining us today in this very special broadcast.
Well, you're welcome.
Felix, the first thing we'd like to know is a little bit about your earliest days. Where are you from and your growing up years?
Well, I was born in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. We lived a very pleasant life. My father and mother and 2 sisters. My memory goes back to a lot of things that were pleasant. As a matter of fact, I remember being taken by my dad to the local rivalry soccer games between 2 clubs from the city of Rotterdam. Many things about my early school days, kindergarten in a Catholic school. Being Jewish, of course, that was quite something, but it was the closest one available. And I do remember the nuns were kind of strict, but it helped me calm down, I would say, and I was ready for grade school when the time arrived.
And ladies and gentlemen, it's remarkable that Felix can remember all of this because he is such a young man. Would you tell the audience how old you are, Felix?
Only 86.
86, a very young 86.
Thank you.
After those early years and the lovely family and growing up in Holland, how was it that you came to be a member of the Dutch Army?
Well, at 19 or 18, depending on when you were born, you have 1 year of mandatory service.
Okay.
Basic training. I was lucky, I was playing the trumpet at that time, and they selected me to go with the band in the city where I was drafted to, Nijmegen, another city that is well remembered during the Second World War. Nijmegen was a very strong battleground during the Second World War. And then after a year at the service, I went back into my civilian life, and from there I was taken into the mobilization in 1939 when the Nazis were threatening to go through Holland and Belgium to go to France and conquer that country.
Mm-hmm. So now you are in the war.
I'm in the war.
In the war. And what happened from the beginning of the war until the time you were placed in a camp? Can you move us to there?
From the beginning of the war, after 3 days of fighting in Holland, in May of 1940, Holland had to capitulate because the Germans, the Nazis, were bombing our cities. Rotterdam was the first one, by the way. Holland capitulated. The Dutch were very angry because they are very independent people. They sabotaged as much as possible. We became so-called freedom fighters. From there, of course, the program started. The restrictions about food and everything that was necessary for normal life. The Yes, the Jews were finally being taken to a ghetto in Amsterdam, and that's when my parents and my sisters went into hiding, like Anne Frank. You know that story, I'm sure.
Yes.
I stayed loose because I had to take the coupons that were needed for food and what have you, and was caught, of course, because I was traveling clandestine. I was being released because the guards in the prison where they took me were still Dutch people and found out what kind of prisoner I was. I was a so-called good guy, and I had to, excuse me, I had to get away from my own name because that was now known, fingerprinted, mugshot, the whole bit. And I went to one of the leaders of the underground, a lady by the name of Mim Squaredo. I have to mention that because she was a very dapper lady, very, very much against the Nazis. She was a Dutch Catholic, a German Catholic lady married to a Portuguese Jewish tailor. She gave me a false identification. I became Olaf Metzelaar. Olaf Metzelaar could not stay in Holland, so he volunteered to go to Germany and became a welder in a big factory in Mainz. So that's where we sabotaged the slides that would take the A-bomb to England. And those slides were so bad that the bombs never reached England. So that was another way of sabotage for the Nazis.
So you're a Dutchman
Yeah,
working in a factory in the city of
Germany.
Mainz,
Yeah.
sabotaging the German war material.
that's right.
Okay, and at some point they found you.
Oh sure, they always find you. But this time, I'm sure they found me through some leak in Holland itself. Because during interrogation by the Gestapo in Frankfurt, they gave me all the particulars about me, my family, and so on and so on.
So they knew that.
So that's when my camp days started.
And where was your first camp?
My first camp was near Frankfurt, a so-called Arbeitserziehungslager, which means a camp where they teach people to become good workers for the German government. That camp probably saved my life because it was so strict and strong that whatever happened after that was not as bad as it would be if you first encounter it. After the Arbeitserziehungslager, I was free, but I was Jew in Germany. And Germany was so-called Judenfrei, which means there were no more known Jews in Germany. So I was sent back to camp, to prison, waited for a transport, and I don't know whether you know what a transport means, but that was boxcars with too many people in it, no facilities, no food, no drink, and on the way to your final destination.
And for you, that was
And
where?
that was Auschwitz. I believed that they were wrong, that I was right. I strongly knew that if I would be able to do what I thought was right, I would survive. That's how I went through the interrogation in Frankfurt to start with, the camps as they were. I can't go into detail because, of course, we don't have enough time, but I'll tell you there were moments that I didn't think I would make it, but I did.
Felix, does something like this look familiar to you?
Yeah.
This piece here?
Yes.
This,
Yes.
what can you tell me about this?
Well, they are the kind of beds, if you want to call it, where we slept in. In the camps that I stayed in, they were a little wider, not as narrow as this one, which was very lucky for us, because that way we could sleep together and have two blankets, because of course there were no warmth, no heat or anything in those barracks, and that way we.
So you had two men in one, and then they were several high.
Oh
like
sure,
this?
yeah, three, sometimes four high.
All right. So you stayed in Auschwitz. That was your second camp,
That was my second camp.
and then where did you go?
And from Auschwitz, that's where they put that number on my arm, by the way. Auschwitz 175288. In Auschwitz, I didn't work at all. I was just sitting in a barracks and talking very, very hard, because there were not many West European Jews. They were all East Europeans. So we had to talk Yiddish in order to understand each other.
So you left Auschwitz.
On a lucky day,
Okay.
on a lucky day, they selected 11 people to go to a different camp. We ended up in Jeliszowicz, which is a coal mine workers camp. That's where I stayed till 1945, January the 10th, when the Russians liberated me.
Felix, the years that you spent in these three different locations, what kept you going? What was it that kept you?
My will to be able to tell the world how wrong Nazism is. I feel, and this is what I tell the kids when I speak at the museum to their classes, I feel that hate has never prevailed in this world, and that tolerance is the only way we can live together and be happy.
Felix, I want to thank you very, very much
Very welcome.
for your words, and very inspiring. And for those of you who have an opportunity to come to the Holocaust Museum, Felix does have a small booklet that describes his life in some detail. This is available in the bookstore. Of course, you know today's broadcast is coming to you from the Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg. So perhaps you'll hear some of the visitors in the background, and we're just going to talk right over them. I want you right now to meet a very, very wonderful lady, Mary Wygotsky. And Mary, I want to thank you so very much for being a part of our Holocaust special program. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Would you please tell us about your very youngest memories, your home and your family?
Well, I was born in 1925 in Vilna. This is northern Poland. And I come from a family that I had two little sisters and a brother, a mother and father. And we were a middle-class family. We lived a comfortable life. We went to private schools. We had help at home. My mother was a homemaker. My father had a leather business. And we lived happily, very happy.
And that was in Poland, you said, in Vilna.
This was all in Poland, right.
Okay.
At that time, Vilna was Polish.
Right. And then Vilna suddenly was taken
by the Russians. The Germans were there in the First World War. Vilna was in Germany. I mean, it belonged to the Germans. But I was born in Poland. Now, much from my childhood, what I can tell you is that happiness, happiness, and happiness. That's what I remember. My mother was a wonderful person. She has raised me with abundance of love and understanding, and education was extremely important in our family. So they were always looking for better schools, and my brother was a year and a half younger than I was. I had another little brother that passed away from an illness, and after that my mother gave birth to my little sister, which was 10 years younger than I was. But during the war, another little sister was born. This was when the Lithuanians were in Vilna.
So Vilna is sometimes Poland, sometimes Germany, sometimes Russia. Is that
Right,
correct?
which is interesting. My mother was born, it was Russia. When I was born, it was Poland. And when my little sister was born, it was Lithuania.
Okay. So then how do we get with first the Russians and then the Germans came to Vilna?
You're right, the Germans, and they gave it to the Lithuanians. And there was this administration that was Lithuania and Germany together. And then of course, the war started in 1941. It's 1939, but in 1940, the Germans came to Vilna. And this is when our family was disrupted, like all the other families, but especially Jewish families, and the hell started. It was horrible. They evicted us from our home. They took us to a ghetto. At that time in Vilna were two ghettos. The population of Vilna was 75,000 Jewish people. And it was a very cultural city, especially Jewish culture that flourished there for many, many centuries. And then when we were in the ghetto, the life there was undescribable in compared to what we have had before, because everything we left behind. So we had to live in one room, our family, and then other members from this was the immediate family. Other members came in later on, and they disappeared, because in the ghetto they would come occasionally and take people away. They would tell us that they are going to work, but they actually took them to Ponari, which was called the Valley of Slaughter, and they would kill them there. And I also remember that this was before the ghetto, that they would hunt men, they would pick up men from the street, and they would go home with them and ask them to take a towel and soap, and they would tell them that they're going to work. So people went willingly, but later on we discovered something different. They found the towels and the soaps in the graves in Ponari. And I also remember that they would be, the boys that have looked for those kind of men would be paid 10 rubles a person. So they were doing it for the money, and this is what happened. And it was a terrible time for us. But this was just the beginning of what I went through later on. We were in the ghetto for 2 years, and my father and brother would go to work. I went for a while. I worked for a short while outside the ghetto. And each time they would come, another member of the further family would be missing.
So you from your home was taken from you, all of your possessions, you were put in the ghetto, and then from the ghetto, what happened with you and your family that brought you
Now,
into
they
the first
liquidated
camp?
the ghetto after 2 years, and at the liquidation, we all went to Rosa, which was a place that they gathered all the Jewish people, the ones from the ghetto, and they divided them. And I was taken away, brutally separated from my mother and my two little sisters. my father and brother, we saw they were on a truck waving to us goodbye. But at that time we thought they took them to work someplace, which they did, to Kaluga, Estonia. They were there, and then of course they died there too. After we were separated, I was put into this car, a car like this, and it was something indescribable. We were all, they pushed us in, and we were standing there like sardines. We couldn't move. There was nothing to drink, and people were crying, and people were yelling and screaming, and they didn't know what was happening. Excuse me, I have to have a drink.
So you rode in a train car just like this on your way to the first camp, and,
Right.
and that must have been maybe one of the more horrible of all the experiences you had.
This
to be in
one of them,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And we arrived, and I do not remember how long it took us. Some people say it was a day, and some people say that it was 3 days. But I was completely in a daze. I couldn't comprehend the whole situation. It was so horrible. But for me, the separation was so terrible that I became. I couldn't function at all.
And you're just a young girl. You're only like 15 or 16
No, I was
years
17
old?
when they separated me.
Okay.
I was 15 when I came into the ghetto.
Okay.
Then after this trip, after this ride, they brought us to Riga, Latvia, which was a camp by the name Kaiserwald. In this camp, it was September, so the snow already fell and it was very cold. We still had our clothes on, but what they did, they gave us clothes with the stripes and shaved our heads. And this was the first experience of a concentration camp. We girls, I was very close with two of my schoolgirl friends that we were all together all the time. We also survived together. But we clinged to each other because we all lost our families, so we felt that we can be together now, from now on. And we stayed there for close to a year in this Arbeitslager. It's a camp that we worked, a working camp. We used to pick up cans and load them in wagons to send them to the ammunition factories. But the snow and the cold was so terribly that all our hands were swollen and frozen. So they felt sorry for us. They made a little tiny factory with a sewing machine, and they helped us to sew the gloves. So when we used to be in this place for a day, they used to have a person a day to sew the gloves. And when I used to come into this place, it was the happiest moment because I wasn't cold and I didn't have to deal with the snow.
Well, that's just the first camp.
This was the first camp. The second camp, then via the Baltic Sea, we went to Stutthof. And Stutthof is in eastern Prussia. East Prussia, right?
Yes, Russia.
And this was a horrible camp. This was the worst camp that I was in there too, because the first camp was Arbeitslager, camp for working. This was a camp, the transit camp. They would bring in people and either kill them in the oven or they would send them away to other camps. But the smell and the horror, what I experienced and saw there was just unbelievable. People were lying on, there was a narrow street, and people were lying on both sides of the street, half dead, people dead, and they would go with a wagon and pick them up and bring them to the oven.
And Mary, when the war finally came, you were liberated
Right.
from the camp.
Not from this camp, not from
From the
Stutthof.
third.
Camp,
You went
right.
to a third camp, and
Yeah.
then you were liberated.
Right.
And who liberated you?
They liberated us, the American army.
The American
There
army.
were Russians too that bombarded the city
Yes.
from the other side.
Right.
But it's the American army that rescued us. But there is in between, there are so many other stories, but I jumped.
Right. No, I understand.
The third camp was also an Arbeitslager. There were also not Jewish people that worked there.
What do you, what do you, how do you explain how it was that you were able to survive the ghetto and then 3 different camps? How did you survive?
This was fate, apparently. I really don't know, but I must tell you a little tiny story. I went to Auschwitz with my son a number of years ago, and I walked out from Auschwitz camp, and I looked at him and I said, Avi, how did I ever survive?
He didn't know.
This was something, it was so well organized. They have done such a magnificent job to preparing the people to the killing centers. And this was, I don't know, but everything was, whenever something happened, it just happened. And I didn't believe in God then. I said, no, there cannot be a God. But of course, later on, everything has changed.
Changed your mind. Yeah. Mary, thank you so much for being with us on the show. I wish we could spend a day or two just talking with you.
I need
You're
weeks.
a wonderful lady, and
Thank you.
your story is fabulous. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm visiting with a really old friend of mine, Kurt Marburg. And Kurt has a very interesting story to tell you. Kurt, thank you very much for appearing on our show. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for inviting me, Len.
Excellent. Now, the tradition on America's Veterans is for us to know a little bit about our guests. So would you please tell us, who's Kurt Marburg? Where are you from, and what was your early life all about?
I was born in Berlin, Germany, well, almost 80 years ago, and lived a very happy childhood in Germany until the Nazis took over the government and Germany changed from a Republican or Democratic government to a totalitarian dictatorship. I am a survivor because I was fortunate enough to leave Germany in 1938, 5 days before the infamous Kristallnacht. And after the war, found out that I had lost 6 relatives who, I suppose, were shipped in these boxcars that we are looking at here right now to various camps in the East. And to this day, I do know when they left, when they were shipped out of Germany, but I do not know when and how they were put to death. But I think their ashes are rotting somewhere in one of the swamps in Poland or Lithuania.
Mm-hmm. So your family was prudent and managed to get out of Germany before the complete Nazi takeover of the family, and you came...
We lived under Nazi rule from 1933 to 1938.
Right.
And I would say were subject to the humiliation and to the prejudices and to the various laws and regulations that were thrown onto us as far as we being in a minority in Germany. Now, a minority, I would say, in those days...
Very different.
Yes, it's different from what we consider minorities today. Minorities in those days were the Jewish population, the, let's say, other religious groups, but those that were not considered part of the philosophy of the Nazis that they withheld because they considered themselves a superior race.
Mm-hmm. Now I know you were a German Jew.
That is correct.
And you came to this country, to the United States, and you became a member of the United States Army. Tell us about that.
Yes. When I came to the United States, I was enrolled into the public school system. I graduated from high school in 1943. The United States was at war in 1943.
Right.
And my first job was with Uncle Sam. And so I was trained in the infantry and joined, let's say after my basic training, the 99th Combat Infantry Division, and went overseas in October of 1944, and we were one of the units that carried the brunt of the Battle of the Bulge. Yes, we carried the northern shoulder, which was the Elsenborn Bridge, and luckily held that against the onslaught of the Waffen-SS. Yes, I faced them twice. I faced them as a child, and I also faced them as a soldier.
Okay, now and tell the audience what happened to you in your encounters with the Nazis.
Well, there were several. First of all, in school, we were humiliated by the teachers, and that is, the teachers had to belong to the Nazi Party. Therefore, they taught the Nazi lies to us already as children. This became unbearable to me personally. And when the humiliation was carried to an extreme end, my father said, "You cannot stay in that system. I'm going to take you out and I will put you in a private school." That was part of it. I also, for example, went to a soccer match. And as we as kids on a Sunday afternoon wanted to see that match, I remember we wanted to pay our admission, and I looked up and there was a sign in big black letters on white background, and it said, "Jews and dogs not allowed." Well, we never saw the match.
So it was very, very wise that your family got you out of Germany, but then once you're back, you're back in the Battle of the Bulge. Let's get back there.
Yeah.
And you were wounded somewhere along.
Well, wounded, I have to say, I contracted a serious case of trench foot. Couldn't walk anymore. Couldn't walk. We didn't have the right footgear in those days in the winters of 44. And Belgian winters are very, very severe. And I would say to you that because of that, I was evacuated. And when I came back, the division had already liberated Dachau.
Okay.
And that little patch here next to me shows the patch of my division. Yes.
Okay. So the war comes to an end, and you remained in the United States.
I remained in the
United
United
States. And years later, having been a child under Nazi rule, having come to the United States, going in the Army, and then, of all places, to be sent back to Germany as a German Jew fighting the Germans.
That's correct.
No.
That's correct.
So with all of that,
right.
Tell me this, why do you think there is any purpose to us studying about or trying to learn about the Holocaust from 60 years ago?
Okay, I have prepared the answer for you on that. I knew you would ask that.
Okay.
The greatest tragedy of tragedies in terms of murder, starvation, disease, and suicide, the Holocaust, has taken its place as a defining moment of 20th century humanity when we learned about human capacity for good and evil. We have learned about the power of states and institutions, even the annihilation of a people. Why study the Holocaust? The reason is simple: because it happened. Much is known about the Holocaust. The killers left detailed records of actions, plans, and orders. They documented the crime because it happened. We must understand the systematic evil, state-sponsored evil, industrialized killings, and mass murders, which was the essence of the Holocaust. We must understand the death camp and the people who staffed such camps. Some were sadists, others were criminals, but many were ordinary men and women doing their duty to fulfill their obligations. Some were professionals, even doctors, who used their skills to become efficient killers. Some were enthusiastic, others more reluctant, all became party to mass murder. The Holocaust began slowly. Age-old prejudice led to discrimination. Discrimination led to persecution. Persecution to incarceration. And finally, incarceration to annihilation. But study of mass murder, genocide, must be in the service of life. To study the evil is to strengthen decency and goodness.
Kurt, in the last minute that we have here, just in your own words, what's the single most important lesson that we could learn from the Holocaust?
I wish to answer that question with a quote from Dr. Elie Wiesel, Auschwitz survivor, Nobel Prize laureate, and professor of Boston University. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of death is not death, it's indifference.
Thank you. Kurt, we're going to have to stop now, but I know you're a man who doesn't stop. You go on, and the audience may not know that these pins indicate that you are a member of the Holocaust Museum and one of the special volunteers that works with the Speakers Bureau, and you're available to work with groups at any time and can be contacted through the museum.
You are very right, and I agree with that.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Here we are in the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and we are being guided by the Director of Public Relations, Diane Tindell. And Diane, thank you so very much for allowing us to come to your museum and learn all about this beautiful place.
Well, thank you, Len, for having me here, and thank you for being here. We are the 4th largest museum in the United States for Holocaust materials and exhibits, and our main focus is actually education and art. We have a huge collection. We give tours to children. We have lots of different programs going on here all year long, but our main focus is really to make sure that people do remember what happens, that they're able to reflect a little bit on what history has provided us with, and actually move forward and be able to rediscover who we are and how we can make this world a better place.
I know that education is a strong suit, and I know that you actually send out to schools trunks filled with artifacts and information, but the museum is available to anyone, am I correct?
Exactly. We have teachers booking their trips here, we have groups booking their trips, we're pretty filled all year long, and anyone is welcome here 7 days a week, basically.
So tell us how the museum is organized in these various pieces.
Okay, we have, let me take you, if I take you
Sure.
through the museum, you'd be best able to see. We have 9 different areas that the museum is divided into, and in the beginning you see we go from the very beginning, the earliest historical perspectives of anti-Semitism, all the way through the liberation and eventually the formation of the State of Israel. And I can walk you right through.
Okay, and we'll just go through the various parts of the museum and give us a close-up on each of the 9 parts.
Okay. If you walk through the first area, what you're going to find is Jewish life before World War II. And in that area, it sort of shows us how there's a timeline. And this timeline actually explains the earliest roots of anti-Semitism. So the Holocaust wasn't anything new. And then as you move along through the exhibit, you're going to see simple life and how people lived ordinarily You had the matzah factory, and we are very personal in our approach to teaching the museum. What we have are photographs that were given to us by the survivors. The photographs that you see are provided to us by survivors from the area, and even the little girl in front of them with all the bakers at the matzah factory, that is the wife of our founder, Edie Lobenberg.
Who is still here.
Who is still here very much, and she actually speaks to the children, and Walter comes in here, and very often you can come into the museum and either hear a survivor speak or meet one. We have Eva, who's the little girl with the bow in her hair, and she actually works here on Fridays at the museum shop. Then we move along, and you have a timeline of how Hitler actually came into power. We're not a museum that honors perpetrators, so it's really the only picture that you're going to see of Hitler is right in this area of the large group of people, and you can just see how overwhelming and how large a group it actually is, and it extends all the way around the wall. And we find that really incredible that someone actually had that much attraction or charisma. I don't even want to use the word charisma, but that much held that much interest for people. The next wall, if you turn around, has all the different groups that were targeted. And we have 11 million that we don't like to give too many numbers, but it was 6 million Jews, and it was 5 million other people who were also targeted and killed during the Holocaust. And that included the Jehovah's Witness, Sinti Roma, the Gypsies, political prisoners, political dissidents. They were all a part of that as well. We had homosexuals, and
disabled persons.
Exactly.
Anyone who didn't fit.
Anyone who didn't fit the Aryan mold.
I just wanted to mention one other thing too. I noticed that given the topic of the museum broadly, that you've presented it in a very humane and gentle sort of way. This is not a place that demonstrates a lot of the violence.
You will not find really graphic pictures here. We are truly a museum of hope. And our goal, our mission, is to get people in here to understand how these things occurred and how this happened. And everything is in small segments, so it takes about 2.5 hours to really wander through the museum. And as you go to each section, you can read about it and then really go home and reflect and think and do much more research. But we bring it to a personal level, and that's our goal here, is for people to understand that those groups that were targeted, first of all, it was the only government-sanctioned, government-sponsored Holocaust, which is really why we're here. And what we find are the people that come in through our doors come out changed, and they've learned something and they've seen something, and hopefully picked up some of the inspiration, some of the hope that we have for humanity and our future. The next section, we have the laws here, which show how exactly Hitler was able to move through the country and really dehumanizing people, taking away the rights of the Jews and taking away their businesses, taking away their homes, putting them into ghettos, taking away jobs. And slowly you can see by the pictures on the wall that these people were dehumanized. They were they were cleaning the sidewalks, there's pictures of that. They're dressed. They weren't dressed to clean the floors. They are dressed to just go for an everyday activity, and they were rounded up. And, you know, after a while you kind of lose your own identity and lose who you are. And we move towards Kristallnacht. The other part has Kristallnacht, and there's a picture of the synagogue that actually our founder, Walter Lobenberg, was bar mitzvahed at, had his bar mitzvah. and you see the destruction. Here during Kristallnacht, 30,000 people, 30,000 Jews were actually rounded up and taken away, arrested. All the glass was broken, which is why they call it Kristallnacht, which is Night of the Broken Glass. They were taken, they were arrested, and then from there, they were forced to go back, clean everything up, plus they were charged for all the damage. And that's really the beginning, and that takes place November 9th in 1933. So we do have
1938.
38, I'm sorry. And we do have commemorations throughout the country commemorating that day. If we walk a little bit further, you're going to come to the world response, the area of the world response, which is the St. Louis. If anyone's ever seen the Voyage of the Damned, that really tells the story of how this ship was not permitted, none of the passengers were permitted to disembark either in the United States or Cuba, and they actually had to go back to Europe, and many of the people there perished. We have a very unusual, wonderful story as well, the story of the Danish rescue, where they used fishing boats, and Jews were taken on the bottom of the boat and kind of laid down there, 12, 15 people, and covered with fish, and then the boats sailed to England from there and taken to Sweden. And from there, after the war, when they came back, their homes, their businesses were all given back to them by their Christian neighbors. So that was a good story too.
So despite the horror of the Holocaust, there were many people who were trying to do good deeds and who were doing everything they could to help, ultimately to destroy the Nazi regime.
Right. And it wasn't all, and people ask us all the time, it wasn't that there wasn't any kind of resistance,
Right.
even in the ghettos, which is the next area over here. Children were an integral part of the underground. There was a lot of underground newspaper. There were people who were still doing religious services, and even though it wasn't all with guns, and it
Right.
wasn't what someone, not a revolution or revolt that way, there were things that were done quietly in order to sabotage the efforts of the Nazis.
Anything to disrupt.
Exactly. We're walking along a little more, and you can see the history. You have the boxcar, which I really don't want to pass, and that is the core of our exhibit. And this is really a tribute to all of those who died and all of those who suffered. And that's what the museum really is all about. In all of the exhibits and everything you see, we are about giving hope, giving inspiration, and really an understanding.
Diane, one of the things I'm looking forward to is the coexistence display. And so could you just kind of tell our audience what the coexistence display is all about?
Okay, we are bringing in from the Museum on the Seam in Jerusalem a tremendous exhibit. They're 3x5 meter billboards that it's an outdoor exhibit, and it will be shown in St. Petersburg in Straw Park, at Bayfront Park in Sarasota, Meisner Park in Boca Raton, and also in Tallahassee. It is, the concept of it is really coexistence and the idea of people learning to live side by side.
Diane, I want to thank you. I want to encourage members of our viewing audience to visit the museum. If you would like to get information about the coexistence display, please contact the museum, and please take advantage of participating in the the coexistence display when it is as close as possible to your home. Thank you very much, Diane. Thanks a lot for having us
Thank you very
once again.
much.
Too often, my country, the United States of America, is criticized for not doing enough, or sometimes for doing too much. Surely we've made mistakes, just like every other nation that has ever been. But when I look back at the 20th century, I see a nation that saved the world from tyranny, not once, but several times. After World War II and all its slaughter, it was mostly American ingenuity, American leadership, and American money that rebuilt the world, including those who made war against us. Then we ended the century by bringing world communism to its knees. No other nation has ever done so much as we have to advance the ideals of freedom and democracy. And I do not see any nation other than the United States anxious to do so today. God bless America.